Then on March 20th, the first COVID death in Ohio. Now there are more than 18,000 Ohioans who have died. We remember some of those husbands and wives, parents and grandparents, siblings and loved ones with the words of those who knew them best, as told to my Statehouse News Bureau colleague, Jo Ingles.
The state's first coronavirus death was someone a lot of people knew, including Governor Mike DeWine.
Mick Wagner, Sr., prominent attorney in Toledo, someone who had been on the Board of Elections, someone who had been prominent in the Republican Party. Mick was very well respected.
Mick's son, Mark, is a former state lawmaker. He says his dad's interests went far beyond politics.
He went to college at Ohio Northern, where he played varsity football. He was a starting running back for Ohio Northern, ran on their track team, ran the 100-meter dash, and somehow found his way on to the Ohio Northern hockey team as well. So he had 7 grandkids, and their number one fan was my dad, who was their grandpa, who was at everything, always checking in with them, always making sure that they had what they needed, having fun with them.
Wagner had pneumonia, so when he fell ill a few weeks later, COVID wasn't suspected at first.
He went into the hospital to get treated for what we thought was pneumonia. And it was the day he went into the hospital was the very day they started implementing all the COVID protocols. So it was the very first day where you couldn't go visit in the hospital, right? Where you had to wear a mask wherever you went. So it was a really surreal experience, because typically when your dad's in the hospital, you have a chance to go see him and spend some time with him. We could just, text each other and video chat and things like that. It was, a difficult time for the family, because dad was really the glue that kept us together. And it was a tough couple of days.
Abe Baggett of Columbus was sick for months before he lost his battle with COVID.
For an 82-year-old, this man literally could do anything. Still practiced law up until the day he got sick, was traveling the world. They had a trip, I think, to Prague booked for either, I think in April of last year. Nothing scared him, including the virus.
But it eventually caught up with him.
He called me on August 21st, and he said, I tested positive for the virus. And I was like, what?
David said his dad seemed to be weathering it okay at first.
It was around day 9 that he crashed and his blood pressure plummeted.
David said his dad was in the ICU for 3 weeks, but got well enough to come home for 1 day, only to be returned to the ICU less than 24 hours later. Then, in October, Abe's condition worsened.
Everything plummeted, all his numbers, his oxygen levels dropped substantially. They took him back to the ICU. And at that point, he was pretty set that I think he knew he wasn't going to make it.
Abe was put on a ventilator. He got an infection in his intestines and colon. He had surgery.
He survived that surgery, which was good, but he never got better. I just said, it's time. His hands are turning blue. He's going to suffocate.
David was at his dad's bedside on the 30th of October when it became clear he wasn't going to recover. Bob Burns was a former volunteer firefighter, a reserve captain for the Stark County Sheriff's Office, and worked as a juvenile corrections officer at Indian River Schools for 29 years.
He taught me that good leaders listen first, they talk second, and they always eat last.
He just was very blunt. He was a very black and white person, and he didn't mind telling you what he thought.
Even though we very rarely ever saw eye to eye, I can say he was probably one of the most respectful guys I know. And yeah, that was Dad.
The Sunday after Thanksgiving, he got a positive COVID test. He continued just to get sicker and sicker. And a week later, he couldn't even stand up by himself. I called the ambulance and we had to help him from the chair to the cart. And he couldn't hardly breathe. I mean, he was just breathing so quickly. And that was the last time I spoke to him.
I'm 28. I shouldn't be burying my dad as a 28-year-old.
Steve Sidebottom of Westerville worked in intelligence for the Navy for 23 years, and later he was an IT risk specialist. His work took him to Saudi Arabia, where he was in the oil industry. His wife of 32 years, Christina, says he was a smart and kind man who had a great sense of humor.
He told great stories. He always made people laugh telling stories. And whenever I couldn't sleep at night, he would just make up stories to tell me till I went to sleep. Just silly stories that he'd make up. But he would always make everybody laugh. And he was a very kind, gentle person. He was a talented musician, and he played the guitar and he sang in our church praise band. And he also played the dulcimer. He loved to read. We traveled all over the world. He worked out regularly. He rode a bicycle. And we had also ridden a Harley trike for many, many years. So really it was just the two of us. We went everywhere together. We did everything together. So it's really hard. I just feel like my heart's been ripped out.
On November 1st, at age 76, Steve died with Christina by his side. Gina Rollins of Columbus wasn't with Mary Ann Rollins when she passed away on August 26th, but Gina was at the hospital when her mom was diagnosed.
They walked in and they looked at me and said, "We have a positive result." And I just looked. I can't even, I was sitting there thinking like, oh my God, how am I going to tell my sister this? What's going to happen? And they're rushing me out the door. And as they're pushing me out the door, one nurse is saying, "Aren't you going to tell her goodbye, give her a kiss or something?" And one's rushing me and one's telling me this. So I went back and I kissed her. And I never saw my mom alive again.
Later that day, Gina and her sister took COVID tests.
But she looked at me and she says, "We got it." I know we do. We came back positive immediately. And our health went down the tube from there. See, she went out on a Monday morning. She went on the ventilator that weekend. And it just seemed like things started going down. And at that time, my sister and I, we were in isolation. The hospital chaplains called us about 6:30, and we got to say our goodbyes over the phone. And they said a prayer with her. And the next call we got was at 8:30, telling us she was gone.
Gina's grief grew later that day as her son was diagnosed with COVID and went into the hospital. 2 days later, her sister called with more bad news. Gina's only child wasn't doing well.
They may have to put him on a ventilator. And at that point, I lost it. I could barely breathe. I couldn't walk. And for a good 15 minutes, with the little breath I had and the little bit that I could walk, I just walked a little circle and I just screamed, "Father, no, and please." I kept thinking, oh my God, I lost my mom. I can't afford to lose my child. And I couldn't get to him. That was the hurting. It hurt that I couldn't get to my mother, but even more so that I couldn't get to my only child. I couldn't see him. I couldn't touch him. I couldn't figure out what in the world is going to happen. Am I going to be doing a double funeral?
Gina's son recovered, and 3 weeks later, the family was able to put Mary Ann to rest. They were finally able to celebrate the registered nurse who worked for the city of Columbus for 50 years, the Delta Sigma Theta member, the woman who had received a special honor from her alma mater.
She was very proud of her accomplishment because she was, I think in the beginning there were 20 Blacks that started the nursing program. And in the end, there were only 9. She was one of those 9. She is listed up at the Ohio State University as a nursing legend. I mean, there's just so much I could say. She opened her arms to anybody and everybody. She loved everybody and everyone loved her.
Diane Dottery was well known in Tiffin, where she and her husband raised their family.
She had my sister 11 months before me, so she had 2 kids that were, not that far apart, and stayed home and took care of the family, volunteered at the local community theater. She was very opinionated, for the most part exercised a lot of discretion, but when she got in the company of like-minded people, she was not the least bit shy to share her thoughts and opinions, and that was always kind of entertaining.
In December, both Diane and Bob, her husband of 63 years, came down with COVID. Bob shook it off, but Diane had several underlying medical conditions.
COVID, I think, just exacerbated that. She was in the hospital for 12 days, received the remdesivir course of treatment, and was discharged. And we thought she was fine.
She wasn't. She celebrated Christmas with the family, but that evening she went back to the emergency room, and that was the last time she left her home. She went to the hospital, then a rehab center, and when it was clear that her time was short, Gary moved her and his dad into their home in central Ohio.
We had her in a hospital bed out in our living room area, and she would sleep a lot, and whenever she would wake up, she would ask what time it was or what day it was, and we'd tell her, and she'd just get this look of amazement on her face, and she'd say, well, what is taking so long? I mean, she was ready to go, and I think that made it easier for us to be able to spend those last few days with her. So we brought her down here, and Dad was here. Dad was here, my wife and I. Dad was here, my wife and I, and one of my daughters when she took her last breath.
Diane Dottery died January 31st at the age of 87. Jim Daniels was a jet mechanic in the U.S. Air Force. Later, he settled down, worked at Lennox, where he eventually became the supervisor of maintenance. He enjoyed woodworking and volunteered with Habitat for Humanity. He was a father, a grandfather.
The guy was just so with it. I mean, we would have conversations about things, and, we'd talk about things that had happened in the past, and we couldn't recall. Middle of the night or early the next morning, I'd get a call. He'd say the word that we'd forgotten and hang up. That would be it. He had a great sense of humor. Yeah. It's just, I'm still just crushed. He found out on a Tuesday. He died on Friday. And even when he made the decision to quit the extraordinary treatment that he was receiving, he was with it, and the nurse said to him, "Do you understand what an extraordinary gift you're giving to your family?" Because we didn't have to make the decision then. And he said, "Well, I love them, and I know they do the same for me." So he was just very matter of fact, but also he fought as long as he could. He said, "This is not living." It was like watching someone drown.
Daniels says 2 of his sisters could not be with his father when he passed because they had COVID.
And the one I was with, who had not tested positive yet, did the next morning after our father's passing.
As a pastor, Daniels says he's seen members of his congregation fighting for their lives. One 37-year-old man in his church has been in the hospital for 5 months now.
We had a couple in our congregation whose 19-year-old granddaughter died from it at the very beginning. We have a couple now whose 9-month-old grandchild has it. The sad thing about it is that we seem to be coming into this stretch drive. We seem to be coming near the end of it, and I lose my dad. And we've been so careful with him through this whole thing.
Canal Winchester resident David Seifert lost his battle with COVID on December 17, 2020. His wife of 32 years says he was an accomplished engineer who also served his community, Bloom Township, as its fiscal officer for more than a decade.
He was just very gentle, very gentle. Our friends would say Dave and I were a true story of opposites attract. He put the gentle in gentlemen. There was not a soul on this earth that didn't like Dave. My husband was athletic, very fit, ran 3 miles every day, even through the first few days of COVID. His exercise was very important to him. He was slender. He ate very nutritiously. And on December 8th, I got a call asking me how quickly I could get to the hospital. They were getting ready to put him on a ventilator. So I went to the hospital, and they had all these people trying to work on him and keep him from being off the vent so that I had time to get there. And I kept it together emotionally at that time because something inside me told me he's going to be okay. And I'm standing outside the glass window, and they had the phone up to him, and I went, "Fight, fight, fight." He gave me a thumbs up. And then I said, "I love you." And he took his hand. And that was the last communication we had.